have to thank Christine for dealing with that and that terribly important challenge. I mean, just about every speaker today, I wanted to change totally what I'm talking about because there are so many issues that relate to. But having worked in that area of the geographical profiling and so on, I have to tell people, when we looked at some material, we couldn't understand why one of the hotspots was actually a police station, a police headquarters. And the reason for that was that when somebody was brought in by the police and they said, where do you live? And he said, well, I'd be on the streets, I've got no fixed abode. The police officer, because they had to fill something in, would put the police station in. So when they did the analysis, the police station would pop up as a place where all these criminals were. And yeah, well, but so my point is that without really understanding what is at the heart of the data, what's generating it, it's open to all sorts of problems. Those hotspots analyses, the patterns you get actually change depending on the size of the square you operate on. You'll get completely different patterns. So the notion that they're picking up these issues totally independently of, as you say, that they have to build in bias into where things have happened and where the police have arrested people, as the big issue in Britain at the moment about the stop and search process. So the problem is, we used to call it tech fix, the idea that you didn't think of what the issues were, you just find a technological solution. And I call it sort of low-grade engineering. It's not science at all. Science, I often say to my students, what do scientists generate? What do they give us? And they talk about data, they talk about computer systems, and I say it's none of that. It's theories, it's ways of explaining what's going on, ways of understanding. That's what science is. I think it was Nietzsche who said, if you give me any why, I can give you the how. It's by understanding the processes and getting to the grips of them that's very important. And we've had a huge range of interesting ideas today. I want to say hello to all those 5 or 6 people who are watching us around the world. If you've been able to follow this through, you've had an enormous range of material presented. We've had high-level Marxist analysis. We've had some great explorations of the future. We've had very broad-based considerations of the way in which the cities are changing and evolving. I partly accepted the very welcome invitation from Tigran because it was over 40 years ago that I published a book called The Psychology of Place. And Tigran, about 3 or 4 years ago, got in touch with me and said, actually, it's quite an interesting book, that. And I had to find a copy of it. Since then, been thinking about how I'm going to develop it further. And there's so many ideas here today that I'm not sure that I will be able to produce just one book on the back of all the issues that have been presented and all the different sorts of ideas that are operating. But in a way, my concluding presentation here is taking us right back to the roots of these whole issues. One of the I think one of the delights of this conference, this symposium, symposium just means a group of people getting together for a drink. That's the origin of the term, discussions over a drink. So one of the delights of this symposium, and it's the only one I think I've ever been to, where there's not been a single bar chart. There's been no graphs, no regression models, and I was a bit worried because I almost invariably draw upon non-metric multidimensional scaling, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with the matrix algebra underlying that, but I decided today I wasn't going to handle it in that way at all. I was going to actually use a sort of photographic essay to illustrate to you this very grassroots thing of how, I mean, in some cases literally grassroots, of how people create places without any sort of design process or influence that is immediately apparent. And to do that, I want to build upon a model that I did develop many years ago. Now, which way does this work? No? Many years ago, this idea that place is a concept. It's a sort of molecule of our experience. It's not an atom, it's a molecule. And it has these three components. It's defined by the actions that take place there, by the way we think about it, the conceptualizations, and by some aspects of the physical form. And any place has that sort of components to it for us to understand it. If I'd have come up with I could have called it a locus or given it some sort of more exotic terminology, and people might have thought of it. But it draws on the idea of behavior setting, the fact that there are patterns of behavior, but it says those patterns of behavior always have some meaning to them. There's always an action behind them, and there's a very interesting distinction in psychology between action and behavior. This is a behavior. Somebody walking is a behavior, but going to the library is an action. Actions always have some implied target, some purpose, and we always have to understand human beings in terms of their purposes in a given situation. And crucial to this is that the meanings of places are based on what we expect to happen there, on our understanding of those places, which in part is shaped by the physical form, by what we know and what we expect, by our cultures and by a whole variety of other learning processes, and is in part shaped by what is possible in those places. So this gives the whole notion of a place a clear construct, but key to it is that the meanings of places is defined as much by the human action in those places as by where they are and the form. Another point I need to emphasize is that it seems to me that the concept of place actually operates at every level in the hierarchy. This is a place here that is defined by the particular physical structure, and it relates to the other places that are defined in this room. The room is another place that has a set of rules and patterns associated, as does this building, as does Reykjavik. And an interesting thing that I discovered in our research is that actually there's not a hierarchy. When I think of Reykjavik, I think of it in terms of its physical form, what ideas I associate with it, what patterns of activity might go on there, just as I might think of this podium. They all interrelate to each other and have the same process. And the key to it, and I would say this as a psychologist perhaps, but it's been repeated over and over throughout today, the key to it is that it's human activity that shapes it. And I like this example of the Golden Gate Bridge. It becomes a completely different place when they have their annual marathon on it. Its physical form contributes something to the nature of that activity, but the activity changes the whole feel of it. I like to show this picture as well, because the little girl at the front is now the head of a television company, and the little boy at the back is now he's a knowledge manager. My son's never quite been able to explain to me what that is, but but what they, pardon? No, he's managing people who write algorithms. And the thing is that they've totally redefined the nature of this ledge in this particular area. So individuals can actually define places by the way they put themselves within it. And one of the things I've been doing over the years is photographing people sleeping in public places. This has already been mentioned a couple of times, and I think it's very interesting to look at how people sleep in public places. I wanted to write a book on it, but my agent said you'd have to get permission from everybody before you use the photographs. So it was not possible. But anyone who sleeps in a public place does it in a different way. In London, they are given these sleeping bags by charities, and they can define that area in a particular way. This is in India, where somebody has created this place for themselves in a public area. This individual is having a break from his stall. And notice the way he's put his shoes, the way he's defined that as a bedroom and created all those sorts of possibilities as he decides this is going to be his bedroom for that particular point in time. Other ways in which individuals do it is by defining the area in terms of particular artifacts. So they're looking at, particularly in developing countries or in countries that, if you like, have a much more open approach to the way in which public space is used, can teach us a lot about what people are trying to achieve and how they're using their environment. And this is what I'm illustrating by these particular processes. And at the heart of it is what I've called the rules of place. Any particular place in which we are carrying out activities has implicit rules associated with it. If I was to stand at the back of this room and try to give the lecture from the back, I would be breaking the rules. If you were all chatting and trying and not trying to fall asleep and just generally ignoring me, you would be breaking the rules. Any place has a whole set of rules associated with this. These can be devious. These are drug dealers in Amsterdam. My son, for a while, had a flat looking down on them, and you could see the way in which the very particular use of that area was defined by what is acceptable, who stood where, who went where. And these rules are absolutely crucial to understanding how places operate. They're implicit codes that come out of the culture, come out of social experiences, come out of the possibilities. And they're remarkably powerful, and that's the point I want to emphasize. And one study I did was actually of the fire that happened in King's Cross Underground Station in 1987, in which 31 people died. You can see the stupidity of many psychologists. I mean, although they awarded me an honorary fellowship of the British Psychological Association, I do not have a lot of respect for a lot of the scientism of psychology, where it pretends to be a science, but actually it's just going through various rituals. And the example here was that when I submitted a paper, we studied the behavior in this fire. When I submitted a paper in which 31 people died, one of the reviewers saying, well, the sample was a bit small for this sort of analysis, for this sort of process. We should have killed a lot more people to make it scientifically acceptable. In fact, what we were able to do was I was called in because I'd done a lot of work on people's behavior in emergencies, I was called in by the government inquiry into this to look at what went on. And the fire brigade had kept a note of where they'd found the bodies of people who died actually in the underground station. And the police had gone round finding out who these people were and working out what route they would have been taking out from knowledge from friends and associates. And in fact, in some cases, couples got separated and one survived and the other didn't. So they gave us this rather gruesome and very unusual information about that pattern of activity. And what we found was that everybody was on their normal route. What happened actually was the fire came up the escalator, and the smoke went into the area where the ticket barriers were. People down on the station below were aware of this. A police officer who was aware of what was going on, guided people up the escalator, because the fire actually started on one escalator. He guided them up another escalator into the area where the smoke overtook them. Because interestingly, we don't actually build three-dimensional models of our experiences. I've seen plenty of architects surprised when their building's actually built, because actually understanding three dimensions is not, our eyes are in front, if you've noticed, and we operate on a level. We don't float. So we tend to see the world in that two-dimensional way, and this police officer just didn't have a model in his head of how the fire was going to spread. And people went through the barriers, and many people would actually wait for each other to go through the barriers. And yet they were on the routes that they would normally have taken. In other words, despite the fact that they were being guided out, it was an emergency, there was smoke, there were some flames, people carried on with the patterns of activity, with the rules that shape their behavior. I've got film of a fire in a football ground with a police officer coming down from the stands, from the bleachers, I think they call them in America, onto the football pitch. He's on fire. He bumps into somebody, and you can see him saying sorry. The social in most disasters, social patterns continue until people are totally aware that it's a completely different situation. I've written a paper about this called "Why Do We Leave It So Late?" That deals directly with the fact that unless the rules of place are clearly no longer applicable, people will continue with them. And that's exactly what's happening with the environmental situation. It happened at the large scale with Rwanda and the genocide there, until people really decided that this was a totally different situation from a normal one. Nothing happened about it. It happened with the Herald of Free Enterprise, with Challenger. It happens in all these big disasters that individuals keep on the existing patterns of behavior that are associated with their existence, with their day-to-day activities, until it's clear that those rules no longer apply. If we heard a fire alarm now, or somebody shouting fire, we would turn to somebody locally to ask them, what should we do? Are they testing something? We wouldn't all rush out. I would, because I've studied a lot of behavior in fires. No, you don't take any risks. That's happened to me in hotels where the fire alarm's gone in the middle of the night. My wife and I were out with a blanket round us before anybody else was out. And eventually the hotel manager staggered out saying, oh, that's always happening with our fire alarm, we'll turn it off. I didn't care that whether I looked an idiot a lot, because I knew that's how people get caught in fires. I always tell my students the one lecture in psychology that could save your life. So we have to look at how these rules of place interact with the local circumstances and the situation. A starting point is the idea of some key point of reference that helps to define a locality as something significant. And I love old standing stones, megaliths around the world that are placed there to indicate something significant, often something sacred. But even if you go to a desert situation, you find that they've used this little shrub as a basis for defining their activities and for making it a starting point for actually, in this case, keeping an eye on the camels. Walls open this opportunity. Then you can add to that, once they start bringing props into that and adding that development. This guy has set up a shop cleaning shoes. It's totally, that box is his livelihood, and it defines his activities and creates the space around it. and again, you always need to look at the details. We've had lots of pictures today of people in public places, and I wanted to analyse and look closely at each one. Look how he's kept the pairs of shoes together, and he's no doubt moving through a sequence of putting the finished ones there and the ones he's about to work on there. There's always a structure to these activities. We carry these patterns of activity with us. This guy's got a small stove for making things. Here, by wheeling in a wheelbarrow, we define the activity. And if you look at the structure of that, of where it's placed, how it relates to the street, how where the shopkeeper sits, what he has organised, it has that sort of structure. And I find these sorts of structures absolutely fascinating, the way in which they define the place that they're operating within and imply a whole set of rules of how you interact with that and deal with it. I did my PhD on open plan office design, and I did a study in an office that had 1,200 desks without anything above seated eye level. And what became very clear is people became very alert to what their section was. They knew that if a phone rang, whether it was in their section or whether it was a desk next to it in their section, people learn these patterns of activity in any social context. So we've got the definition of the place, we've got bringing in props, we've got adding shelter helps further to identify the place, and we had some interesting examples earlier, and that begins to turn it into a very particular type of context. And it's studying these components that help us to understand how public places are used. And I've been talking about individuals and about people setting up their particular processes. But once you get a group of individuals, they then begin to define their area in relation to their activities. And they will shape that in relation to the opportunities and the possibilities that are available. I mean, here a group that have crept in around the bikes that they look after. This is a group of lads actually in a mosque who are no doubt involved in something slightly nefarious. Here are a group of people, taxi drivers waiting for fares. They've created these card playing clubs. There's always a shape to that. There's what I always like to point out that the way we interact today in terms of lecturing and teaching or of group discussions and activities, it must have been the same in ancient Greece in the academy there. There is a natural process that is shaped by what we expect of each other and by the culture and context that we're part of. Here's a group of lads that I like to show you because this young lad saw me taking the photograph and got very annoyed with me because I was interfering on his private activity. And there's all sorts of interesting things going on there. There's the older man who's clearly in part of it. There's the more open, active individual. He's puzzled about what's going on. I mean, and as I say, he spotted me because of the angle he's sitting at and wanted to comment and deal with that. This was a much more friendly social group that, again, the definition of the structure we totally recognize, although this is in India and there are all sorts of other historical and cultural processes we might not be aware of, we totally understand this activity. And this illustrates also a thing that I've been trying to keep a record of. It's amazing how often you can take a social group, and I suggest you do this, and if you want to send me details, please do. You look at any social group and you look at it in plan. Can you draw a line with the men to the one side and the women to the other? I play in a town band, and to one side the flutes, clarinets, mainly women, to the other side the brass, the tuba and the trombones, mainly men. Where does that all come from? I mean, even in the modern era, our culture has all sorts of things that shape that. And finally, the actual processes that people are part of, some group processes, then introduce further rules. And of course, in India, wherever you go, any open space is where they will play cricket. I found that amazing coming from Britain, which really is a football culture. Any open space, you'd play football, and I've always thought you don't need anything for football other than a ball. Cricket, I've always thought, is a highly technological and remarkably boring game, in which you need, you need bats, you need some sort of wicket, you need players. I was always sent into the outfield as a fielder and used to settle down and go to sleep. But it's just so endemic in that culture and really happens anywhere. So I've tried to draw attention to the fact that there are structures in the use of places that are shaped by expectancies, by patterns of action, by physical forms and how they can be modified. And even in what would seem like a very open context of a desert situation. Again, when you look there, the camels are put in one location. If you look into the structure of what goes on in the tent, there will be male areas and female areas, there will be sleeping areas, and there will be other areas for public use. In fact, I've been discussing this with some archaeologists who reckon that they can work out the pattern of gender usage in Neolithic areas by where the chippings are of various uses. So the men making the chipping, making the axe heads and the arrowheads, leaving a pile of chippings. The women at the back dealing with cooking and other activities. And just the detritus that's left suggests a pattern of activity. So within all this context, just to sort of draw out the design implications, which in many ways summarizes an awful lot of what has been said today. I don't think anything I'm suggesting is really very different from what's been said today. First of all, the design shouldn't be considered as being for one particular purpose. People imply their purposes. And in fact, one of the hypotheses, if you like, of the theory of place I've outlined is that there's no such thing as a multi-purpose place. What happens is people will define different purposes for what they're trying to achieve in those places. If they conflict with each other, there will either be conflict or it will be managed, say, through time changes or the putting up of barriers. One of the stupidest things that architects got into in the 60s and 70s was the idea that you could produce an open plan school that had no walls and therefore it would be an open educational system. Well, that doesn't take account of the fact that teachers have lessons with kids. Kids make a lot of noise, teachers make a lot of noise, and it totally interferes with the way in which those activities are structured. And again you find that the pattern of activity is shaped in relation to what people are trying to achieve, and that this therefore means that you don't have multiple use, you have lots of different places operating. And I did meet somebody who in Mexico said she designed a park using these ideas, thinking very closely, where are they going to play football? We don't want them to play football there, so we'll plant lots of trees. Where will people want to walk? Where will people want to sit? Where will people want to be quiet, and so on. And if you get school children to design a playground, you'll find that that's what they'll do. There have been a number of activities doing that. One of the things that happens when you ask school children to design a playground is that they will immediately ask for a little place where they can sit and chat. I have to say, particularly the girls, but they will actually give shape to those activities. So it's how the spaces provide many different opportunities for people to create places within them. And one of the things possibly we'll discuss in the discussion immediately is that we have to assume it's all going to change and develop over time. Today there's been lots of commentary about the changes in the economics and of course there are big changes in the cultural mix in pretty well all of our countries. In fact, even here in what we think of as the frozen north, I've already spotted a lot of the service industry is by people who are immigrants into the country, and that's changing all over the world. In London, it's quite difficult to find somebody whose English is their native language. My grandchildren go to schools in which there are 80 different languages spoken at home by the different kids. Not all by the same kids, of course. One of the problems of having a deadpan sense of humour is nobody ever laughs, but there we are. And as I say, open areas get defined in all sorts of different ways. And it's the changes in these components and the patterns of interaction between them that is what we have to explore and develop, and what needs to be at the heart of design. And what a totalitarian attitude towards the nature of places, deciding what people are going to use it for, rather than the possibilities, the potential it offers, is going to be damaging, and in fact won't necessarily work. Some of the most effective office buildings or homes are converted churches. The people who developed them originally had no idea what was going to happen to them. So people will bring something to bear. A very early study I did when I was part of the Building Performance Research Unit that has always stuck with me was that we looked at school buildings. We looked at 20 or so school buildings. We had the plans of the buildings, and working with an architect, we worked out how much the building had changed. And then I did a survey of teachers at how satisfied they were with the school building. And there are three sort of models you can have. One is that the building gets in the way and it's a real problem, so the more you have to change it, the less satisfied. The other is that there would be a sort of balance, some sort of homeostasis of people adjusting stuff to keep it in line with what they achieve. And the other one would be that people actually interact on the building and change it, and therefore it's more satisfactory. And we found a very strong relationship between satisfaction and the amount of changes. I can go on at length, of course, about all this, but another interesting example is if you ask people what they remember most about a museum or an art gallery, or where they spend most time, do you know what the answer is? Exactly. It's the shop. It's where they're in control, where they're agents, where they're interacting, where they're looking to what it is they're going to achieve in that particular situation. So finally, places are always going to evolve and unfold, and that's what provides a rich process of interaction with places for designers and all the other people involved in shaping places to generate and to be part of. I have to finally tell a story that is, many people, if you've heard me talk before, you'll have heard me say it before. I've said it all over the world. I should probably get the Guinness Book of Records, for telling a story in the most different places. But it's an absolutely true story of when I worked in a school of architecture in the early days, and I was giving lectures to architecture students. I wanted to encourage them to get involved in this whole process. And I asked them if they had any questions, but they were a bit reticent. Architects I find, don't engage in the same way, for instance, as planners and other people involved in urban design and so on are much more open to these issues. But after I finished, a student very hesitantly came forward and said, can I ask you a question? And I thought, well, at least I can hand on, the light of knowledge to the next generation and, you know, encourage this individual. So, of course, I said, yeah, yes, sure. What is it you'd like to know? And he said, where did you buy your jacket? It's absolutely true. And it's always struck me as a huge allegory or metaphor for the problem of the psychologist talking to the design professions. Of we're trying to talk about what's inside, what the processes are, but there's a tendency to deal with it as an external process. Well, thank you. And I just wanted to see if I could illustrate how you can change the nature of a place by the activity by seeing if I can get this to play after its journey. Perhaps not. I'm so dry. See, that's what acrobats do, you know, they always sort of wobble to make you show that it is actually a difficult thing to do. Sorry, I'm sure you're now curious to know what sound it makes. Thank you.